Around this time of year, your favorite YouTubers put out their top 10 games or movies of the year lists. But if you're anything like me, you don't play enough of the year's releases at launch to have an informed opinion. You'll wait literal years for things to go on sale, and you'll wait even longer if it means a game can get patched and fitted with DLC to arrive to you at its maximum potential. If you're like me, you just don't play enough to keep up with everything. So in the interest of us perpetually late gamers, I figured I should stay away from recommending you new games and instead celebrate New Year's with hindsight. 2020 hindsight, to be precise. Here are my top 6 games from 5 years ago? Believe it or not, the standard caveats still apply. I still haven't played every game released in 2020 and likely never will. But the ones I'm interested in include Yakuza Like a Dragon, I'm still working my way up through the past entries, Umurangi Generation, and Kentucky Route Zero. On the flip side, we have the games I did play and loved, but which didn't quite make top 6. First, there's The Last of Us Part 2, a game I actually did play at launch. While I have mixed feelings about a lot of it, it is a game that stayed with me, and one I honestly have more to say about than I do most of the titles on my actual list. Every person I spoke to about it had a markedly different experience. And that's also kind of what the game is about. It's a story about being haunted by unrealized potential, and the lengths we go to fill that void, and it haunts the player in much the same way. Meanwhile, Kingdom Hearts' Melody of Memory put the series' best, and most uncontroversial, feature center stage. Its excellent soundtrack was translated perfectly to a rhythm game with a surprisingly brutal difficulty curve. Functionally, this means that boss fight music feels like boss fights. Field music feels homely and welcoming, but still complex enough that it requires intimate concentration. Last but not least, I have to shout out Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time. It was a return to form for the series years in the making, and one that both revisited the roots of the original trilogy and also integrated many of the offbeat ideas from subsequent games with its zany multiverse setting. It got me thinking about the reasons we gravitate towards multiverse stories, and also inspired my most offbeat video yet. Now, without further ado, here's the actual 6. I played Ghost of Tsushima not long after I played Red Dead Redemption 2, and were it more organic in its encounters and open world design, I genuinely believe it would be held in similar regard. I use that word organic very deliberately. Its world feels organic because Sucker Punch clearly worked hard on its environments and wildlife, but I think for the average player, its encounters might not. 5 years ago, I loved how many side quests I discovered just riding through the world, but when I think back now, a lot of them blend together. They were all part of Tsushima's checklist, its map filled with waypoints and familiar activities to cross off. There aren't a lot of misadventures to get up to in the open world that aren't mandated by the developer. There are very few emergent narratives to be found like in Red Dead. Unless you're me. See, there's one experience in the game I do remember vividly, and one that felt emergent. While exploring, I came across a climbing path. So I climbed. I fully expected to find some kind of material reward or activity at the top. Everything about the surrounding environment signaled to me that that's what was up ahead. But my only reward at the top was a view. It wasn't even one of the game's best views, this one just felt fine. I can't even remember where it was. But something about that mundanity made it special. It felt mine. And it felt of its moment. Eventually, Ghost of Tsushima became the game that made me go all in on virtual photography. It's still got one of the best photo modes I've ever used 5 years later, because it understands the importance of giving players a variety of versatile tools to compose their photos, so that each photo can become its own story, and those tools, in turn, helped me discover intrinsic rewards for myself separate from the game's various extrinsic ones. Suddenly, I was seeing props and background objects as more than just their functions. It was so rewarding to discover that killing an enemy soldier without killing their eagle will result in the eagle returning to their body to mourn. This game changed the way I think about the intersection between detail and narrative in games, and I'll always appreciate that. But I don't think the game thrives on aesthetic alone. Gameplay-wise, its best innovation might be the guiding wind system, which does a tremendous amount to mitigate the waypoint issue I named earlier, in a way more, dare I say it, organic than any of its contemporaries. Instead of following a map or compass, you follow the wind. It's so simple, and yet so much more immersive. Sometimes you encounter animals on the road who you can follow to new discoveries. Again, a nice touch you can already see popping up in other games here in 2024. Tsushima's primary narrative, meanwhile, is a moving meditation on what honor even means, and the game takes care to explore this from a variety of perspectives through its diverse ensemble. Is there one true definition? Can the rigidity of that definition suppress us? If the honor system in Red Dead was about Arthur reckoning with his own lack thereof growing up, here it's posed as Jin Sakai, reckoning with its cultural connotations. Astro's Playroom was a shock to the system when I got my PS5 a few years later, not just as a tech demo, but as an excellent platformer in its own right. Maybe this would have been a more surprising pick before the recent sequel, Astrobot, won Game of the Year 2024. As it stands though, Playroom is packed with callbacks to PlayStation history, but what still jumps out at me is everything else. It also feels like it pays homage to influences beyond Sony's ecosystem. It's an explicit celebration of PS history, but also a more implicit one of its broader genre. Let's just say it was completely unsurprising to me to hear Nicolas Doucet pay tribute to Nintendo in his Game Awards speech. Mostly though, Astro's Playroom looks forward. It still boasts the best use of the DualSense controller's haptic feedback, and, paired with the multitude of high-speed gimmicks and varied biomes, it is the closest that games have gotten to replicating the tangible feel of theme parks. The rush is real. Astro's world buzzes with life and literally sings around you, making brand synergy and technophilia feel like fairy tale magic. It's hard for me to describe just how much I love Giant Squid Studios' The Pathless without going in depth about the story, so I'll say this. Open world games are, by design, about going off the beaten path. So what happens when you make that an explicit part of the narrative? Like in many prominent titles before it, you can rush through the Pathless' story or take your time exploring and solving puzzles in the open world. Neither is a correct choice per se, but the story ultimately reckons with what aimlessness and a lack of structure even means. It means freedom and agency, and when it comes to our relationship with the environment, it means recognizing that environment as a free and sovereign thing as well, one we often try too hard to tame in our own image. Your boss fights are against these giant corrupted animal deities the game's antagonist has twisted into husks of their former selves. You need to restore a set number of each of their shrines before you can challenge them. Before that, they wander the world, every bit as pathless as you. So part of your exploration also involves planning around them, trying your best not to wander into their vicinity by accident. Gods forbid you get pulled into one of their dread storms. The actual fights, when you're ready, clearly pull inspiration from Shadow of the Colossus. They're puzzles and races more than they are traditional fights. It isn't quite as self-aware as Shadow of the Colossus about how much we center ourselves in the lives of other creatures, and it's never willing to get quite as ugly, but there is an optimism inherent in that helps the Pathless stand on its own, separate from its influences. Like Colossus, the rest of the game is devoid of combat, so there are no regular enemies to shoot your arrows at. You spend most of your time exploring, solving puzzles, and, well, listening to the dead. Par for the course for a Matt Nava game, a lot of the storytelling is environmental, but it's also got some really poignant words from the few dead spirits that still linger here, as messengers from a tragic past. One of the credited writers is Kelsey Beecham of Outer Wilds fame, if that tells you anything about how emotional these vignettes from the past can be. The other is Steve Lerner, who went on to write 12 Minutes. There is one other thing you spend your time doing, though. Yeah. Did I mention that your bow and arrow are a movement mechanic? Movement feels euphoric in the Pathless. Here, what is in other games depicted as a tool for violence is reimagined as a tool for navigation, as you rhythmically shoot emblems while running to build up momentum. It feels like you are constantly shooting at where you want to go and then chasing the arcs of your own arrows. It's unique and it feels so good. Giant Squid's next game is about skateboarding on a sword. That is enough premise to sell anyone on, but having played The Pathless, I'm excited to see how that will thematically work as well. Animal Crossing New Horizons might be the most you-had-to-be-there game of the year. Maybe the decade? But it still feels important to list it here, 5 years on, because it was just that definitive of the moment. During early quarantine, so many people found community and socialized through this game, and they got to do it in creative ways. Your island was your home, so you had to make sure it was well decorated, and a good reflection of your personality for any potential visitors. You could create your own designs for clothes, and both express yourself through them and share those designs with others like a digital trendsetter. At a time when we were all isolated and curled up in our own bubbles, it provided a virtual space to hang out and build and design and bond. My partner did a lot of this. She was our island's primary host and made a lot of friends through inviting people to it and going to visit others. I'm less social as a gamer, but for me, New Horizons provided an opportunity to bond in a second, more intimate way too. I would leave little gifts and notes for her in the game to wake up to, and she would do the same for me. We were living together in real life, albeit isolated from our friends and family, but here, we got to build a larger, more zany home in a fantastical setting. We got to know the various villagers and talk about who each of us was closer to, then decide who else we wanted to add to our little cast. We used a third player character, a teacher, to host a school on our island. We went on virtual dates and picnics on the game's special holidays, or left each other little surprises in the world to discover later. During Bengali New Year, we even dressed up in the traditional colors and in South Asian garb to celebrate. Coupled with the fact that the time of day and all the shops and villagers' routines reflect your real-time clock, we also found a familiar rhythm to the gameplay. There was very little pressure to min-max. At most times, we followed the game's pace. Hanging out at night felt markedly different from hustling around in the early hours, and all of that felt so familiar and so calming. The two of us play a lot of co-op games together, but New Horizons felt like a second, illusory life we built, a pocket universe we coexisted in at the same time we were sharing our home. That's not to say it was just a good quarantine game though. I do think it still boasts a lot of room for creative play, especially with all the items and features they added in the following months. I confess I don't boot up the game very often myself now, and I didn't find quite as much joy with the Happy Home expansion as my partner did. But every time I do feel a sense of pride and comfort. New Horizons came out at the perfect time, but it wouldn't have had such staying power if it wasn't also a good game. Charmingly animated, rhythmically paced, and mechanically curious about each and every one of its players. Now, these last two are genuinely interchangeable. Both are games I consider in the highest regard, not just as games of the year, but as all-time favorites. Supergiant Games' Hades is the tightest game of 2020. I am not a roguelike person, but my god am I a Hades person. The combat is perfect. Any given run provides so much room for a creative improvisation, and when you finally get far enough to start tuning the difficulty up, those difficulty boosts manifest in some really cool ways too. It's not just you learning and getting better with every attempt. The bosses claim new tricks up their sleeves as well. All of this is tied together with a deep narrative about what it means to leave a home and to keep getting dragged back anyway. The family who supports your ambitions and the family who doesn't. The friends who cheer you on and the ones who resent you for wanting better. None of this means Zagreus is flawless either. He rejects his home in a way that, he'll come to learn, he never fully can. Home with all its battle scars is a part of us, and accepting that is a vital part of breaking the cycle and moving forward. It is, as Ashley Barrett and Darren Korb's killer song goes, in the blood. Nature and nurture are not at odds in Hades. They're both direct influences on Zagreus' life. This may be a family saga about gods and demigods, but every character is so believably, recognizably human. I know these people. I've seen love manifest as jealousy and shame manifest as violence. I've felt that impulse too, to run, and to not look back. But like old Orpheus himself, I do inevitably look back. You're not punished for failing a run in Hades. You can actually look forward to getting booted back into the house, because your friends and family will often have new things to say. In this way, even failure results in progress. The story moves on. Your relationships with these characters move on. The script for this thing is 21,000 voiced lines long. Checking in on your ensemble is always worth it, and in your more solitary moments, you also get to self-reflect, and upgrade your skills and weapons, and maybe even this home. You might be leaving, but while you're here, home should feel like a home, no? If Hades is about making peace with your roots no matter how gnarled, Final Fantasy VII Remake is about accepting you have no control over how your branches will grow. Adapting the 1997 original's first act, it follows Cloud and his friends' adventures in the bustling industrial city of Midgar, and my god, did Square Enix do a momentous job of fleshing out Midgar. The NPCs here are admittedly static, but they are all mouthpieces for a breadth of world-building. Even in incidental dialogue, they offer diverse, meaningful, and often hilarious commentary on the socio-political circumstances around them. Walking around, you can't help but notice how fully they've realized their vision for this city, taking advantage of the PS4's hardware all these years later to really make it a fully developed world in and of itself. I loved the city in the original, but I understand its people and its infrastructure and its commerce on a deeper level now. Its division of wealthy people living on top and the poor living below was always as obvious class commentary as you could portray, but even that divide is fleshed out in ways that feel real and complex. Aerith is a particular highlight in our main cast. Voice actress Brianna White perfectly embodies both the nurturing, spiritual instincts of a woman left to the last of her people, and the spunky street smarts of one raised in Midgar's dilapidated Undercity. Her Aerith understands better than most what is actually at stake in a very abstract, metaphysical way. This makes John Eric Bentley's Barrett a perfect complement. Barrett understands the stakes from the most grounded, immediate perspective. He lost his home to an ecological disaster, and is now trying to build a life in the city as a single father. They are admittedly the pair that interacts the least throughout the game. Cloud and Tifa are the glue that binds all their lives together. But when they do, both the camaraderie and the contrast become immediately apparent. Together they give, for lack of a better phrase, older sibling energy? The DLC also introduces your next party member ahead of Rebirth, the Great Ninja Yuffie. It tells a fully original story that didn't exist in the 1997 original, and yet sets up the future of her arc quite well. All of the other interpersonal relationships are well documented by this point, and it's hard for me to look back on them without the influence of my 100 plus hours on Rebirth. But what I do want to do is shout out the foundation that Remake set back in 2020. The combat is something of a golden goose in the genre. All 5 playable characters feel great to control and have their own unique playstyles. And yet, they're also unified by a core system that is easy to pick up and limit-breaking to master. It melts together the action-based combat of a Kingdom Hearts or Devil May Cry with the turn-based thoughtfulness and strategy of a classic Final Fantasy. I cannot recommend revisiting it on the hardest difficulty enough. This entry is probably unsurprising to anyone who's a regular on the channel. I'm going to vaguely gesture at some spoilers here, and expand on all this in some future video looking at the larger series. FF7 Remake felt like it was designed specifically for me. At a time when I was working on my thesis novel about fate, free will, and what it means to be in the canon, Remake came out and tackled those themes, but from the point of view of a remake. Of a game, mind you, very much in the canon. Wasn't this story already written? Didn't we know what would become of these characters? The game took that certainty and made it a source of existential dread. I'm not going to go into detail about how that transpires here, but I will say that I appreciated how clear and meditative this theme was, even in the minutest of details, something I struggled to echo for its 2024 sequel. And it all works because the characters do feel that dread. Maybe not in the same meta sense we might, but in the sense of concern for their planet. Shinra, the electric power company that dominates most of their city, also seems in control of their fates. They're poisoning the planet with their processing of Mako energy, and those repercussions are trickling down to the people closest to the ground who live, literally, below them. And yet, like in Hades, even this hellish undercity is a home. It's the home Cloud, Barret, Tifa, and Aerith fight for. Remake builds on the 1997 original's legacy with the recognition that climate decay itself is an existential threat. It is not just about saving the planet, it is also about our relationship with it and all the ways that's impacted by corruption in the government and media interests and industrialization. In Midgar, these things chip away at the people. They cause them to lose sight of their individual selves as they're pulled into the orbit of economic forces beyond their control, as they seek escape in hedonism and drink, because it's all left they can afford. But shouldn't we, the game posits, imagine and fight for a better future? Shouldn't we resist doomerism and do the best we can, no matter what fate may have in store? The question is posed twofold. Once as the immediate danger posed by Shinra, and again as a more looming metaphysical one posed by their legendary ex-soldier Sephiroth. This is, after all, a remake. Hasn't this story already been written? I did play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, the second installment in the trilogy, in 2024. It was my favorite game that year as well, but whether it stays as such is anyone's guess. I have a lot to catch up on, so who knows? Maybe I'll do this again and tell you in 5 years' time. But the thing about Remake is it has stayed with me consistently for the past 5. I don't even consider its story to be quote-unquote incomplete, because the open-endedness is the point. The idea that there is an unknown journey ahead is evergreen, no matter what the sequels pull. It had a cohesive theme, complete in and of itself. Its themes about government corruption and environmental collapse are one and the same with its themes about fate and free will. Its characters' struggles with their memories and sense of self are one and the same with our cultural memories of the original. To weave all of that into one game about one central conflict was a titanic feat. I will always admire it for that. So, those were my favorite games of 5 years ago. I don't know if I'll do more of these lists, but I really wanted to make that pun about hindsight being 2020. A lot of these are also games I'll talk about again in more detail someday, so I hope my thoughts piqued your interest. Feel free to let me know if you have suggestions for things I should play from the current year so you can hear me talk about them way too late. And in the meantime, belated Happy New Year's. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. "2024 was the strongest year yet for the channel. NPCs of Tears of the Kingdom is my biggest video of all time, which feels very gratifying, because it's also the one I worked hardest on. I also really enjoyed covering Spider-Man 2 for the series, and really sunk my hours into covering Final Fantasy XVI, which was also a lot of fun. It's been nice to learn that the NPC series is resonating with people. I know I've been quieter in the back half of the year, and that's largely because my day job got a lot busier, but rest assured I have been quietly cooking more for that series, with multiple pots on the burners, so I will have something for you soon. But that doesn't mean things slowed down on the essay side. I was just named on the Sight and Sound list for Best Video Essays of 2024 for my micro essay on representing Monsoon in games. Alongside so many creators I admire. I contributed to all 3 of the Essay Library's anthology collabs for the year. Lamphoot's excellent essay mixtape about food and culture, which is also mentioned on the list, and Post Mesmeric's A+ video on Kingdom Hearts 4 and Anticipation. I also joined on as a contributor with Palette Swap, a team of former hard drive writers, and just the loveliest collaborators, who are doing incredible things in both the satire and critical essay spaces. So if you like my writing, you can find more of it by following them. I recommend my piece on Crash Bandicoot and the comedy of unlimited lives. You know, as this channel grows, I'm finding myself writing down more ideas than I know what to do with. Some of those ideas will realistically never get made as videos. But having more outlets for my writing, where I also get to talk to and work with some really smart people to flesh them out, well, it means they do get made. So, yeah, good year. Lots of links in the description. And here's to an even better one ahead.